Rowan wasn't seeking glory when he cut the ropes, but by saving 7 orcs from Bloodstone's gallows, he pulled the thread of a conspiracy that threatened to erase an entire clan from the northern marks. There are 3 kinds of silence in the northern marches. The first is the silence of snow, heavy, white, honest. It covers everything with the same even-handedness. The grave and the barn, the dead child and the planted seed, it does not judge. It simply erases. The second is the silence of men who have seen too much. That one covers nothing. It hangs between the shoulders like cold iron, and you carry it even when the sun comes out. The third, and the most dangerous, is the silence that precedes a decision that will change everything. That silence makes no sound. It simply stops the world for a moment, as if the universe is waiting for you to decide who you really are. Rowan knew the first 2 well. He was about to meet the third. The mule's name was Old Iron, and it was an apt name. She had the same temperament as metal when it cools, hard, resistant, and completely indifferent to the discomfort of others. Rowan held the reins with thick hands, knuckles white from the cold, rain driving sideways like small, ill-tempered needles. The load in the mule's saddlebags was 12 bars of cast iron he had hauled 3 days from the Coldwater forges without selling a single one. The Tescan Pass, at that hour of the night, was a strip of mud and stone that the rain had converted into something close to clay paste. Each step of the mule produced a wet, resigned sound. Each step of Rowan produced the same. His leather boots had long since stopped being waterproof. He was 43 years old and looked 60, not from weakness. Forge men age differently. They don't wither, they harden. Rowan's back was curved not from defeat, but from years bent over the anvil, years bearing the weight of ignition and incandescent metal. His hands were maps of small scars, each one a spark that had found skin before metal, each one a price paid without complaint. The house waiting for him in Millbrook was worn masonry, with a leak in the east corner that sang a single note when it rained. The forge was out back, the leather bellows patched 3 times, the anvil inherited from a blacksmith who had died leaving neither family nor debts, which Rowan considered a remarkable achievement. There was a bed with old straw, a table with one leg shorter than the others, and a leather screen on the window that filtered more heat than wind. There was also an absence. Rowan didn't think about the absence in words. It had no name he was willing to say aloud. But it was there every night when he arrived, sitting in the chair no one else used, smelling of bread and dried lavender. The 2 aromas he had learned not to notice anymore, because noticing them was unbearable. For years he had not bought bread. He ate broth and grain. For years he had not planted lavender on the windowsill. The rain hit harder. Old Iron snorted with authority. It was then that the torch, the only one he carried sheltered under his leather cape, lit up the curve of the pass, and Rowan stopped. There was something on the oak posts that lined the shoulder before the bridge over the Tescan. Figures, 7 of them, hanging like defeat flags on a windless day. The blacksmith stood still for 3 heartbeats. The third silence, the one that waits for you to choose. Then he walked forward. They were women. That was the first thing he registered. The second was that they were breathing, faintly, with the effort of someone using the last reserve of something very precious, but breathing. The third was their skin. Dark green, almost wet moss in the wavering torchlight. Ears elongated and pointed upward, bent slightly by the weight of their inclined heads. Eyes closed, features that held nothing brutal. They held something severe, sculpted, like the face of a warrior, carved in dark granite by someone who respected her. Orcs. Rowan stood looking for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he did what blacksmiths do when faced with something broken. He assessed the problem and reached for the right tool. The forge knife was on his belt, It had a 20-centimeter blade, made of steel he himself had folded 4 times. Good for cutting leather, good for cutting rope. He tied the torch to the mule's harness with a lumberman's knot, tested the light, and began to climb the first post. The oak was wet and slippery as soap. Rowan wrapped his legs around the trunk, feeling the damp bark scratch through his leather breeches, and climbed with the methodical slowness of someone who is in no hurry to fall. Reaching the height of the rope, he gripped with his left hand and cut with his right. A firm stroke, no hesitation, the blade passing through the twisted hemp with a dry, tearing sound. The orc fell. Rowan came down fast enough to cushion the impact with his left shoulder, taking part of her weight, letting the rest be absorbed by the mud. It wasn't graceful, it was functional. He moved to the second post, and the third. Each fall was a different weight. Each body was a different temperature, some already too cold, others still holding the deep warmth of someone who resists. He didn't allow himself to think about anything beyond the next post, the next rope, the next cushioned fall. At the 5th, he nearly slipped. The bark gave way under his knee, and he hung suspended for an instant with his arms wrapped around the trunk, heart beating at a rhythm that didn't suit a man of 43, rain running down the neck of his cape. He closed his eyes, breathed once, climbed. At the 6th post, the mule snorted and stepped back 2 paces, the torch swaying, shadows dancing over the faces lying in the mud. Rowan cursed the animal with the fluency of a man who had spent decades around stubborn beasts, and kept going. On the 7th and final post was the oldest. He could tell even with her eyes closed. There was something in the structure of her face, in the lines around her mouth, in her bound hands that bore scars of work and battle in equal measure. Her hair was braided with leather cords and small pieces of carved bone, and even soaked and heavy, they kept something deliberate about them, something of ancient care. Rowan cut the rope. She fell differently from the others, controlled, even unconscious. As if her body knew how to fall from years of muscle memory, he caught her in his arms and felt her weight, real and immense, and set her in the mud with as much care as the circumstances allowed. Then the amber eyes opened, not startled, not confused, direct, with the strange lucidity of someone who woke from the bottom of a well and still knows their own name. The voice came out rough, like metal dragged over stone. They haven't won yet. Rowan crouched in the mud, looking into those old amber eyes, and said nothing for a long moment. "Not tonight," he finally replied. "But you're going to need somewhere to stay." She didn't say yes. She said what her eyes had already said, that she was deciding whether he deserved trust, and that the decision was not yet complete. Rowan stood. He began organizing the unconscious bodies along the mule, tying them with cargo ropes so they wouldn't fall. There were 7 orcs and an old mule and a blacksmith with a curved back and a single possible destination in that rain. "Old Iron," he said to the mule, "you're going to have to forgive me for the extra weight." The mule snorted, which was as close to agreement as Old Iron ever got. The Millbrook forge was not large, it was enough. There was the anvil at the center, the bellows on the east wall, the tools hung in order of use: tongs, peen hammers, ball peen hammers, mandrels of various gauges. A chisel he had remade 3 times with the same iron. There was a shelf with resin, linseed oil, leather strips for grips and handles. There were embers sleeping under the ash, still warm enough to wake with little effort. Rowan woke the embers first. The 7 orcs were laid on the forge floor in a row, the oldest, who had remained awake throughout the entire journey back, in silence, watching every bend in the road with those unblinking amber eyes, sitting with her back against the wall, her arms around her own knees. Rowan went for the rags. There was a chest with cloths he used for polishing and protecting cooling metal, clean enough for what was needed. There was also a small cauldron that sat on the edge of the forge, and he filled it with water from the covered well at the back of the yard, dropped in 2 rib bones he kept hanging for broth, and set it to boil without comment. The marks on the orc's wrists were deep. The rope had cut where the skin was thinnest, and on some the flesh was exposed in irregular lines, reddened by cold and friction. Rowan treated each wrist with the same attention he gave delicate metal, washing first, drying slowly, applying pine resin that he knew stung but also sealed, bandaging with the softest leather strips he could find. None of the 6 unconscious ones woke during treatment. Bodies that survived on reserve strength tend to sleep deeply when the threat passes. The oldest watched him work in silence for an hour. "You have practice," she finally said. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. A blacksmith who doesn't learn to treat burns and cuts early on doesn't last long, Rowan answered, without raising his eyes from the wrist he was bandaging. "Neither do orcs," she said. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence between 2 craftspeople who recognize in each other someone who learned their trade the hard way. "Madra," she said. He raised his eyes. "My name, since you'll be tending to my wrists. Rowan. Blacksmith Rowan." She let the title sit in the name as if testing its weight. "Why? Why what? Why did you cut the ropes?" Rowan finished the bandaging. He folded the ends of the leather strip with care and sat looking at his own hands for a moment. The spark marks, the thick skin over the knuckles, the right index finger that had broken once and healed crooked. "Because they were still breathing," he said. Madra was quiet for a moment. "That is the simplest answer I've ever heard to that question. It's the only one I have." The broth began to steam. Rowan served 2 tin mugs and handed one to Madra without ceremony. She accepted it without ceremony. They drank in silence while the forge embers crackled and the 6 other orcs slept the heavy sleep of survivors. Outside, the rain had stopped. In its place was only the dripping from the roof edges and, beyond the leather window, the first pale grey of a dawn that arrived without conviction, as if it too wasn't sure it deserved to appear. They woke throughout the morning, each in their own time. The second to open her eyes was Draca, the youngest, 18 or 19, with initiation scars still pink on her forearms and a gaze that alternated between aggressive distrust and poorly controlled curiosity. The third was Sora, broad-shouldered, silent as a stone in a riverbed. The other 4, Vrenna, Ground Mara, Cool, and the one they called simply Sister 6, woke at irregular intervals, each rising slowly, each spending the first seconds reassessing where they were and whether it posed a threat. Rowan stayed out of the way of those assessments. He stood at the anvil, hammering a piece of iron with no specific purpose, just to keep his hands busy and produce a familiar sound that said, "This is a place of work, not of ambush." It was Draca who spoke to him first directly, with the blunt frankness of the young who haven't yet learned to soften what they think. "Why didn't you leave?" Rowan stopped hammering. He looked at her. "This is my forge." She processed that for a moment, as if it were new information. "The humans who captured us said anyone who helped us would be hanged alongside." "Then they'll need to find more rope." Draca stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then, for the first time since she'd woken, the corner of her mouth moved into something that wasn't exactly a smile, but was the infrastructure of one. It was in the afternoon that Madra brought out the document. She had kept it inside her clothing, against her skin, in a leather case sewn with tendon thread. Even soaked, and having spent the night hanging from a gallows, the piece had survived. She opened it on Rowan's table, with the care of someone opening something that has no replacement. The ash seal was a piece of boar leather, the size of 2 sheets of paper, cured to perfection and covered in writing in 2 languages. The upper half, in common of the marches, contained a treaty. The lower half, in Orcish runes, held the clan's response and recognition. At the centre, a seal pressed in black wax bore the symbol of the Westmarch Council, a set of scales with a sword in place of the beam. "This document," Madra said, running her finger along the edge without touching the writing, "recognizes the lands of the Ash clan in the Iron Peaks as inalienable property, with rights of mining and pasture. It was signed 42 years ago by Councillor Aldrich before he died. No councillor after him moved to revoke it because the law was clear." Rowan looked at the document, then at Madra. "And now? Now, the Marches Bank and the Silver Mining Company have discovered that there is silver in the Iron Peaks in a quantity they call obscene. And they've discovered that as long as this document exists, they cannot touch the mountain." She folded the leather case and tucked it away again. "So they decided the document should no longer exist, and that we, who are the only living witnesses to its validity, should not either." The silence in the forge was different this time. It was the silence of a gear clicking into place, of a blacksmith understanding the full structure of a piece for the first time. "Who gave the order?" Rowan asked. "The banker Bracker, the man everyone calls the Bloody, not for violence, but because he drains the blood from things until they stop working, and Captain Krugo, who carries out orders for whoever pays most. Krugo." The name entered the room like a cold draught under a door. Rowan went very still for a long moment. The hammer in his hand suddenly weighed differently. No longer like a tool, like a memory. "I know that name," he said. There was one thing Rowan never told anyone. Not out of shame. Shame was an emotion he had spent completely on other things. It was because telling required choosing words, and choosing words required revisiting the place where the memory lived, and that place still smelled of smoke and ore clay and the kind of silence that was none of the 3 he knew. It was a 4th kind, the silence of what should never have happened. But Madra was sitting at his table, with the ash seal tucked against her chest, and she had a way of waiting that neither demanded nor dismissed. It was the waiting of someone who knows the other's story matters, but won't ask for it as a favor. So Rowan told her. The village of Marek lay in the iron borderlands, a day's walk west of where his forge now stood. It was a cluster of 20 families who lived by pulling iron ore from the shallow gravel beds of the Marek River. Not rich, not grand, but enough. Rowan's wife was named Elia, and she had chestnut hair she pinned with a wooden comb he had carved in the first winter they were together. His son was named Dan, and he was 5 years old and had the unreasonable determination to want to learn how to work metal already at that age. Krugo had arrived in the name of the Marches tribute, a tax the council had established to fund protection of trade routes. The village had paid in the first year. In the second, the tax had doubled. In the third, it had tripled. And Krugo's representative had arrived with news that there were retroactive interest charges on the previous years. Marek had no way to pay. The representative had left with the debt records. Krugo had arrived personally 3 weeks later with torches. They called it pacification of tribute resistors. The fire had lasted the entire night. Rowan had survived for reasons he still didn't know how to name. Perhaps cowardice, perhaps the accidental kind of luck that finds people who don't deserve it. He had been in the pasture with the mule, fetching iron from the gravel beds, and upon seeing the first flames had run, and upon seeing the soldiers had hidden in the only ore pit in the area, deep enough to cover a grown man, and had stayed beneath the cold earth while the world above burned. When he climbed out in the morning, there was no more Marek, no more Elia, no more Dan and the wooden comb and the 5-year-old's determination. There was only Krugo mounting his horse on the road, the red march's cloak on his back, satisfied as a man who has completed a tedious but necessary task. Madra listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, they were silent for a long time. The forge embers crackled. Outside in the yard, Sora and Draca were tending to their rope wounds with the calm, methodical focus of those who cannot afford to be consumed by pain. What they did to the clan, Madra said at last, was different in its instruments, identical in intent, erasing what cannot be bought. Rowan looked at her. Your wife and son. She continued, you didn't save them because there was no way to save them, not because you didn't want to. It was a simple thing to say. It was something no one had ever said to him in all those years. He sat looking at his own hands for a long moment. There is a time when choosing to hide is only survival, Madra said. And there is a time when choosing to hide is complicity. The difference is that you already know which one you're in now. Rowan didn't reply, but he picked up the forge hammer resting against the anvil and held it with both hands, not with anger, not with performance, with the simple weight of someone who decides this is the tool and this is the work. On the second day, Sora found tracks in the field behind the forge. They weren't accidental tracks. They were the tracks of two men who had stopped, watched, and returned by the same route, which meant they were not hunters and not farmers. They were paid eyes. Rowan looked at the tracks in the cold mud with the expression of someone who already knew the bill was coming soon and had only underestimated how soon. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing the ironwork. The leather window got a wooden panel with iron hinges. The forge door, which had always closed with a simple latch, got a crossed iron bar he had started at 2 in the afternoon and finished at 5, his hands on the bellows and his mind running calculations of a different kind. How much time they had, how many would come, what the preferred entry point would be for men who did this kind of work. The 7 orcs did not stand idle. Draca trained in the courtyard with a hoe handle she'd found in the storage shed. Short, efficient movements, the concentration on her face of someone who learned that improvisation is a skill as much as technique. Sora moved Rowan's iron saddlebags in front of the low windows without being asked, with the silent pragmatism of someone who reads spaces in terms of cover and exposure. Madra oversaw all of this from the center of the yard. Leaning on the shoulder she had sewn with a bone needle the previous night, a stitch that Rowan had quietly inspected and judged better than most he had done on wounded men. "There's a bounty on your head," he said to Madra in the evening as they checked the provisions. "I found out from one of the farmers who came to have his scythe sharpened. Bracker is offering 10 silver coins for information on the Ash clan's whereabouts and 20 for the seal." Madra did not seem surprised. Surprise would have been an unnecessary luxury. "And for my head specifically?" she asked. 25 silver. Rowan paused. "You're worth more than the document. Because I'm the only one who can identify it as authentic before the council. Leather can be forged. Witnesses are harder." They stood a moment looking at the provisions. Grain, dried root, 2 small cheeses a farmer had left as payment for a bolt job. Enough for 10 days, maybe 12 if they rationed. "When they come," Madra said, "it won't be a visit. It will be a sentence wearing a uniform." "I know. You could hand over the seal and leave. Say you helped us without knowing who we were. They'd probably believe you." Rowan looked at her with an expression that was not irritation. It was something closer to the weariness of a question that shouldn't have needed to exist. "Madra, I ask to know what I'm working with." "Count on the blacksmith," he said, "and on the forge hammer." There was a silence. Then something Rowan had noted as rare happened. Madra smiled. Not widely, not easily. It was a smile that knew its own cost, that had learned to allow itself sparingly because the world didn't often deserve it. "Blacksmiths in the marches have a tradition," she said, "of marking what they forge with their name. So it's known where it came from. I know it. When this is over, she said, this place will have a different name in the clan's stories. It won't be the Millbrook Forge anymore. It will be something else. Rowan didn't ask what. There were things that only made sense after they happened. Outside, as night began to fall, the fog descended from the fields like something with intention, and within it, right at the edge of where the human eye can still reach, there were points of orange light, torches. Krugo had the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, not because it was impressive. It was merely loud, the kind of voice that fills spaces and expects others to step back to make room. "Blacksmith, Rowan of Millbrook, come out with the beasts and the document, and we'll pay you 10 silver coins." He sat astride a grey horse, his red cloak soaked with fog, but still attempting authority. Behind him were 16 men, 8 in the March's uniform, 8 with the look of hired hands, which differs from soldiers in ways that matter. Soldiers have loyalty to rank. Hired hands have loyalty to payment, and when the payment seems uncertain, they recalculate. The banker Bracker was not at the front line. Bracker was never at the front line. But Rowan recognized him in the figure at the rear, on the heavy horse, in the dark cloak with no insignia, in the posture of a man who watches others do the work with arms crossed and the account already open. Rowan stood in the forge entrance. He hadn't run. He hadn't hidden. He stood with the forge hammer in his right hand, a 40-centimeter instrument of iron and oak wood that weighed enough to command respect. Krugo shouted the offer again. 10 silver coins. Rowan was silent for a moment. There was the image of Elia with the wooden comb. There was the image of Dan, wanting to strike metal at 5 years old. There was the image of the ore pit and the sound of fire above, and the silence after, that fourth kind of silence he had carried for years like a weight on his shoulders. And there was Madra, beside him. Not behind him, beside him, with an improvised axe made from a splitting hatchet and an iron handle she had reinforced that afternoon while he worked on the door. The sewn shoulder that had made no sound, the amber eyes assessing angles and distances with the cold precision of a calculator forged in battle. Rowan looked at the imaginary coins. Then he looked at Krugo. "There isn't a single silver coin worth the bread and roof agreement," he said. It wasn't a speech. There were no metaphors and no proclamations. It was simply the declaration of a law, older than any March's tribute, older than any mining company or bloody bank, the law that says when you open the door to someone who is falling, you have chosen a side, and choices have weight, and weight is precisely what a blacksmith understands. The 7 orcs took position around the forge, as if they had never been hung. Krugo gave the order. What followed was a mud courtyard battle in dense fog, the kind of fight that has no elegance or drama, only the raw work of defending a space against superior numbers. Rowan used the hammer not as a weapon of attack, but as an extension of the forge, blocking, deflecting, creating iron chaos in a small space where the larger number became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. Sora took down 2 soldiers with the silent efficiency of someone who wastes no movement. Draker was fast in the way young people are when they don't have enough fear to slow down. She hadn't yet learned the fear of disadvantage, which that night was a blessing. Vrenna and Kool worked in a pair, controlling the south flank of the courtyard with communication in short grunts that Rowan didn't understand, but which functioned as precise language. Madra didn't fight from the front. Madra went for Bracker's flank. The banker didn't expect to be the target. Bracker was a rear-line man, accustomed to having bodies between himself and the consequences of his decisions. When Madra appeared from the left side, horseless and on foot in the mud, Bracker wheeled his heavy horse in an attempted escape that put him exactly where Sora was waiting. Krugo fell when Rowan removed the horse from under him, not by harming the animal, but by startling it with a hammer blow on the ground that produced a metal thunderclap loud enough to make any animal retreat 2 meters. Krugo fell into the mud without grace or glory, and lay there looking at the foggy sky with the expression of a man who recalculated too late. The battle in the mud courtyard of Millbrook lasted until dawn. The dawn over Millbrook was not beautiful that morning. It was simply grey brightening to white, the fog settling to the ground like something that had given up, staying suspended. The forge courtyard, with its boot marks and blood and churned mud, telling a story without words. 6 soldiers were tied with their own armor straps. The other 8 hired men had made the recalculation hired men make when payment seems uncertain, and had fled north before the battle ended. Krugo sat in the mud with his hands tied before him, the red cloak now brown with clay, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of a man cataloguing what he has lost. Braca was bound with the very ropes his men had brought. There was a symmetry to that which Madra had indicated without comment. Simply placing the banker against the forge wall with the hanging ropes wrapped around his wrists and ankles, and leaving him there to contemplate the equivalence. Rowan walked the courtyard counting the wounded, not in others, as a polite way of speaking, literally counting the wounded in others, because that was what there was to do at that hour of the morning, and because concrete work was the way he had of processing what had happened. Draka had a cut on her right forearm that needed stitching. She had applied pressure herself, with the expression of someone making note of the damage for future repair. Vrenna had a broken or fractured rib, breathing short, and Ground Mara had twisted her ankle in the mud near the end of the battle. Sora had no visible wounds, which Rowan had begun to suspect was less luck and more extreme competence. Cool and Sister Six had scrapes and bruises in the proportions that were the normal vocabulary of courtyard combat. Madra had a new cut on her left arm, crossing over an old scar, and had said nothing about it. "You're going to sit while I take care of that," Rowan said to her. "I'm fine. I know you're fine. Sit anyway." She sat. In the way she obeyed was something that was not submission. It was the kind of concession experience men and women make when they recognize the other person is right, and that fighting it would be a waste of energy that could be better spent elsewhere. While cleaning the cut with water and resin, Rowan said, "The seal is intact." "Intact," she confirmed. "Sewn to the body. They never got close. West March is 2 days' travel. I know where West March is. The council has open session on the 7th day of the month. That's 4 days from now." Madra turned her head to look at him. He continued tending the cut without raising his eyes, which was both technical focus and a way of saying what needed to be said without making it more than it was. "You'll need an escort," he said. "Blacksmiths are not escorts." "Millbrook blacksmiths who have met Krugo personally are a reasonable exception," he replied. "And I have a mule that knows this stretch of road." There was a silence. Then, "You don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to." "Rowan." He finished the bandaging, folded the ends, looked at her. "There is a difference," he said, "between what one is obliged to do and what one chooses to do. I learned late that the second is the only one that counts for anything." Outside, Krugo still stared at the ground. Braca had stopped trying to work loose the ropes and also stared at the ground, but with the expression of a man already calculating how to explain this to the next banker in the chain. The Millbrook Forge, with its worn masonry walls and east corner leak, stood that morning with the quiet solidity of things that were built to last and had the good fortune to be used for the right purpose. The West March Council recognized the ash seal on the 5th day of the month, not without resistance. There were 2 councillors with ties to the March's bank who attempted to question the document's authenticity, the witnesses' credibility, the legitimacy of the original treaty. But there was also a 42-year archive with Councillor Aldrich's signed record, and there was Madra, standing before the council with her sewn shoulder and her amber eyes fixed on the councillors' faces with a calm more intimidating than any threat. And there was Rowan beside her, with his calloused hands, and a testimony that detailed every particular of the gallows night, with the methodical precision of a man who forges metal and knows that measurements matter. Kruger was arrested by the March's own authorities, who had been happy not to look for him while he was useful, and even happier to have somewhere to put him once he ceased to be. Bracker lost the Silver Mining Company's operating rights in the Northern Marches for treaty violation, which for a man called the Bloody for his ability to drain resources was a more efficient sentence than any rope. The lands in the Iron Peaks returned to the Ash Clan. The excavations were suspended. The company's property markings were removed by the council's own messengers under Sora's supervision, who accompanied each removal with the expression of someone finally able to mark something as finished on a very long list. In Millbrook, in the square where the crude oak gallows posts had stood, they planted a stone pillar. It was not a grand monument. It was a limestone rock the height of an adult man, chosen from the dry bed of the Tescan, white and solid and without pretension. On it, a chisel carved 7 names, not the names the world used for the clan, not the names from tribute and property records, but the names they used among themselves, the names that carried the weight of those who chose them or received them from someone who loved them. Madra returned to Rowan's forge before departing for the Iron Peaks. She brought no silver. She arrived with an axe. It was not an ordinary axe. It was a piece forged with ore from the Iron Peaks, the same ore the company had coveted, worked by the clan's blacksmith in the hours between the battle and the departure for West March. The blade had the specific hue of mountain iron, dark with reflections that shifted with the angle of the light, as if something alive dwelt within the metal. The handle was oak, wrapped with black leather, and on the blade 2 marks were carved, the symbol of the Ash Clan, and beside it, in simple blacksmith script, the letters R.M., Rowan's initials. She positioned it above the forge door with the gravity of a rite. "In the clan's traditions," she said, "an axe above the door means the house is protected, that whoever lives here holds alliance with whoever forged the blade." She turned to look at him. No tax collector, soldier, or banker's hired hand enters Millbrook without thinking twice about what that symbol means. Rowan looked at the axe for a long moment, at the marks on the blade, at the initials that made the protection personal and not merely symbolic. "I was never rich," he said. "It wasn't a complaint. It was a record." "Neither was I," said Madra. "The clan has land and has work and has what it always had. A place that is its own. That isn't poverty. It is exactly enough." Draka came to say goodbye with the affectionate bluntness of youth, a handshake that was more grip than necessary, "You're not terrible for a human," that was, on her scale, a considerable compliment. Sora said nothing, only tilted her head in a gesture that Rowan had learned to recognize as something between respect and mutual acknowledgement. The other 5 departed with the wave of those who know the road continues, and that long farewells are a luxury for those with time to spare. Madra was the last. At the forge entrance, she stopped. Without turning, she said, "Next week, Draker will need someone to teach her how to make a door bolt that doesn't give. The bolt on the north entrance of the clan's camp broke last month." Rowan stood looking at her back. "I can make a bolt," he said. "I know." A pause. "You know where the Iron Peaks are." She left. The sound of boots in the courtyard mud faded. The mule, Old Iron, tied to the post outside, watched the departure with the philosophical indifference of an animal that has seen everything and no longer has capacity for surprise. Rowan stood in the forge for a long time. The east corner leak sang its single note because it had rained that morning and there was moisture in the air. The anvil was at the center, silent, waiting. The tools hung on the wall also waited. The 3 times patched leather bellows waited. The table with the shorter leg waited. And above the door, The dark iron axe with its mountain reflections waited, not with urgency, but with the solidity of a promise that needs no repetition to be true. Rowan went to the bellows and began to work. That night, for the first time in years, he slept without the fourth kind of silence. He slept with the simple kind, the snows kind that covers everything with even-handedness and does not judge. That erases what must be erased and leaves standing what was built to last. The oldest law of the northern marches is not the gold of lords nor the silver of merchants. It is the honor barter. You gave me shelter, I give you my spear. And what Rowan had given, without silver, without glory, without even certainty that he would survive to see the outcome, was simply the only thing a man with a blacksmith's hands has to give when the moment calls: the work, the open door, the choice, and choices, like metal on the anvil, hold. You don't choose the blood in your veins, but you choose whose fire you stand beside, and that is the only kinship that holds.